In 1951, the escape of 2 American agents revealed the biggest security breach in U.S. history, but the real shock was hiding in plain sight at the heart of American power. May the 26th, 1951, before dawn, the Canadian coastline emerged through the morning fog as Robert Sullivan gripped his whiskey bottle with trembling hands. Beside him, Michael O'Brien paced the ship's deck, anxiously scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Both men had been at the pinnacle of American intelligence. Sullivan ran the Soviet Affairs Division at the State Department. O'Brien worked deep inside the CIA, but none of that mattered anymore. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail, because both had actually been working for Moscow for 15 years, and now they were fleeing to Soviet Russia. When the ship docked at Halifax Harbor, other passengers thought they were disembarking for a short Canadian vacation. But Sullivan and O'Brien had no intention of returning. With forged Soviet passports hidden in their coats, they were bound for Moscow via a circuitous route through Montreal and Europe. This is where everything changed. Monday morning brought chaos to Washington, D.C. 2 senior intelligence officers had vanished without a trace. The FBI discovered their empty apartments, abandoned cars, and a trail that led straight to the Canadian border. But the real question, haunting the corridors of power, was who had warned them to run. 1934, Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut. But here's the truly shocking part. James Mitchell was the golden boy of Yale's class of 1935. Brilliant, charismatic, and from one of Connecticut's most prominent families, he seemed destined for greatness in American politics or diplomacy. But the Great Depression had shattered young Mitchell's faith in capitalism. As breadlines stretched across American cities and fascism rose in Europe, he became convinced that only Soviet communism offered hope for humanity's future. At Yale's secret societies and intellectual gatherings, Mitchell found others who shared his revolutionary fervor. Robert Sullivan, an economics major from Boston, Michael O'Brien, studying international relations, Thomas Blackwood, son of a Supreme Court justice, and David Hartwell, whose father owned half the steel mills in Pennsylvania. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, but someone else had been watching these privileged young radicals: Soviet intelligence. On a crisp October evening in 1934, Mitchell received an invitation to meet a European intellectual at a secluded restaurant in New Haven. The man who greeted him spoke with a slight Russian accent and introduced himself only as Professor Volkov. Over dinner and vodka, Volkov painted a picture of a secret war between the forces of progress and reaction. He asked Mitchell a simple question: would you be willing to serve the cause of human liberation, even if it meant keeping secrets from your own government? You won't believe this, but Mitchell didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, whatever it takes. By Christmas 1934, all 5 Yale students had been recruited. They called themselves the New England Study Group, but Moscow knew them by their code names. Mitchell was Patriot, Sullivan was Pilgrim, O'Brien was Minuteman, Blackwood was Liberty, and Hartwell was Constitution. The cream of American elite society were now Soviet agents. 1941, Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. What you're seeing now is nothing. James Mitchell straightened his tie as he walked through the corridors of the State Department. World War II was raging, and America had finally entered the fight against fascism. Mitchell had landed his dream job as a senior analyst in the European Affairs Division, with access to the most sensitive diplomatic cables and military plans. His colleagues saw him as the epitome of American patriotism, a Yale man who'd turned down lucrative Wall Street offers to serve his country. They had no idea that every night Mitchell photographed classified documents in his Georgetown apartment. Wait, you haven't heard the worst part yet. That evening, Mitchell sat in his car outside a small cafe in Alexandria, Virginia. Rain drummed on the windshield as he waited for his Soviet handler. At exactly 9:30 p.m., a woman approached, elegant, well-dressed, speaking with a slight accent that could have been from anywhere in Eastern Europe. "Professor Mitchell," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. "I'm Elena. I believe you have something for us." Mitchell handed her a manila envelope containing photographs of the latest Allied invasion plans for North Africa, detailed assessments of Soviet military capabilities, and, most damaging of all, a complete list of American intelligence operatives working behind German lines. "But here's the real bombshell." Elena smiled as she examined the documents. "Moscow is very pleased with your work, but they need more. We're particularly interested in American nuclear research. Can you access those files?" Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. Nuclear weapons could end the war, or end the world. "I'll see what I can do," he whispered. As Elena disappeared into the night, Mitchell sat in his car wondering if he'd crossed a line from which there was no return. 1943, Los Alamos, New Mexico. This is where the real atrocity began. David Hartwell pulled his government-issued sedan off Highway 285 and onto the dusty road leading to the most secret facility in America. As a liaison between the War Department and the Manhattan Project, he had access to the laboratories where American scientists were racing to build the world's first atomic bomb. The desert sun blazed overhead as Hartwell approached the heavily guarded checkpoint. The soldiers recognized him immediately. He'd become a familiar face over the past 6 months, shuttling between Los Alamos and Washington with regular reports on the project's progress. What they didn't know was that copies of those same reports were making their way to Moscow. You haven't heard the most treacherous part yet. That night, in his Los Alamos quarters, Hartwell carefully photographed the latest technical specifications for the plutonium implosion design. His hands shook as he captured images of diagrams that showed exactly how to trigger a nuclear chain reaction. He thought about the scientists he'd met, brilliant men who believed they were shortening the war and saving American lives. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer himself had shaken Hartwell's hand just days earlier, thanking him for his dedicated service to the nation. Believe it or not, this betrayal went even deeper. The next morning, Hartwell made his regular trip to Santa Fe under the pretense of picking up supplies. In a small photography shop, he developed his film and created duplicate sets of prints. One set went back to Washington in his official pouch. The other set disappeared into a hidden compartment in his car. 3 days later, those photographs were in the hands of Soviet nuclear scientists. By August 1945, when America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin already knew exactly how to build his own. The nuclear arms race had begun, fueled by American secrets stolen by American traitors. 1947, Arlington Hall, Virginia. Wait, this detail changes everything. Captain Sarah Williams hunched over her desk in the basement of Arlington Hall Station, home to the Army Security Agency's most classified code-breaking operation. For 3 years, she and her team had been trying to crack Soviet diplomatic cables intercepted during the war. The project, codenamed VENONA, was considered impossible by most experts. The Soviets used unbreakable one-time pad encryption, with each message encoded using a completely random key that was used only once. But the Soviets had made a crucial error. The real breakthrough is coming. While examining a stack of 1944 cables from the Soviet embassy in Washington, Williams noticed something odd. 2 different messages, sent months apart, contained identical encryption patterns. Her pulse quickened. This meant Moscow had reused encryption keys, violating their own security protocol. Working 18-hour days for months, Williams painstakingly reconstructed the cipher. When she finally cracked the first complete message, Her blood ran cold. The cable was from the Soviet intelligence resident in Washington to Moscow Center. It contained detailed information about American troop movements in Europe, obtained from a source code named PATRIOT, someone with access to high-level State Department communications. You won't believe what she discovered next. Over the following weeks, Williams decoded dozens more cables. The picture that emerged was terrifying. The Soviets had penetrated the highest levels of the American government. Sources codenamed PILGRIM, MINUTEMAN, Liberty, and Constitution were feeding Moscow everything from diplomatic secrets to atomic bomb blueprints. The Chicago Five were about to be exposed. 1950, FBI headquarters, Washington, D.C. This is the moment everything accelerated. Special Agent Frank Morrison studied the decrypted VENONA cables spread across his desk. As head of the FBI's Soviet espionage section, he'd seen plenty of spy cases, but nothing like this. The scope of the penetration was staggering. PATRIOT had provided the Soviets with advance warning of D-Day. Constitution had given them the atomic bomb. MINUTEMAN had revealed the identities of dozens of American agents behind the Iron Curtain, agents who had subsequently disappeared and were presumed dead. But the investigation hit a wall. The problem was identification. The VENONA cables used only code names and contained frustratingly few biographical details about the sources. Morrison knew that PATRIOT worked in the State Department and had attended an Ivy League university. Constitution had access to atomic secrets and came from a wealthy Pennsylvania family. But without more specific information, they could be any of hundreds of government employees. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. On a cold February morning in 1951, Morrison's phone rang. The caller was Professor Elena Kozlova, a Soviet defector who had recently arrived at the CIA's safe house in Virginia. She had worked for the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, and claimed to have vital information about American traitors. "I can give you names," she said simply. "Real name." Morrison grabbed his hat and coat. Within an hour, he was sitting across from a woman who would change the course of American history. February 1951, CIA Safe House, McLean, Virginia. You're not prepared for what comes next. Elena Kozlova sat in the sterile conference room, chain-smoking American cigarettes, as FBI agent Morrison and CIA Director Alan Dulles listened intently. Her English was perfect, her manner calm and professional, but her words were devastating. "I personally handled communications from 5 American assets recruited at Yale University in 1934, she began. They were considered Moscow's most valuable sources in the United States government. She opened a leather folder and withdrew 5 photographs, Yale yearbook pictures from the class of 1935. Here's where your world collapses. James Mitchell, recruited first, codename PATRIOT, currently Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Morrison felt his stomach drop. Mitchell was one of the most respected diplomats in Washington. Robert Sullivan, codename PILGRIM. He runs the Soviet Analysis Division at State, another pillar of the foreign policy establishment. Michael O'Brien, codename MINUTEMAN, senior analyst at CIA. Morrison realized that O'Brien had probably seen every report Morrison's own team had filed about Soviet espionage. But the worst was yet to come. Thomas Blackwood, codename Liberty, federal judge with access to classified legal proceedings, the son of a Supreme Court justice now sitting on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and David Hartwell, codename Constitution. He provided the atomic bomb blueprints from Los Alamos, the scion of a Pennsylvania steel fortune, now serving as Deputy Secretary of Defense. Elena stubbed out her cigarette. "There's something else you need to know. My handlers in Moscow received word 2 days ago that American counterintelligence was closing in. Emergency extraction protocols had been activated. The race against time had begun. Morrison was already reaching for his phone. Some of the most important people in American government were about to disappear, unless the FBI could stop them first. May 25th, 1951, Georgetown, Washington, D.C. This is where loyalty shattered forever. James Mitchell sat in his elegant Georgetown townhouse, staring at the telephone. It had been ringing for the past 10 minutes, but he was afraid to answer it. Through his window, he could see a black sedan parked across the street. FBI surveillance, no doubt. The phone finally stopped ringing. Then, almost immediately, it started again. This time, Mitchell picked up. "Professor Mitchell?" The voice was barely above a whisper. "This is your old friend from New Haven." The betrayal was already in motion. Mitchell's blood turned to ice. It was Robert Sullivan, using the code phrase they'd established 17 years ago. It meant only one thing: run. "Elena has defected," Sullivan continued. "She's given them everything. The professor says to implement Phoenix immediately." Phoenix was their emergency escape plan, a route through Canada to a Soviet freighter waiting in the Arctic Ocean. Mitchell had hoped he'd never have to use it, but Mitchell made a fatal mistake. "What about the others?" Mitchell whispered into the phone. "Blackwood and Hartwell are already gone. O'Brien is meeting me at the rendezvous point. You need to move now." Mitchell hung up and ran upstairs to his bedroom. From behind a false wall, he retrieved a suitcase he'd packed years ago. Fake passports, $50,000 in cash, and a Colt .45 pistol. What he didn't know would seal his fate. As Mitchell prepared to flee, FBI agents were already surrounding the houses of his co-conspirators. Sullivan had been caught trying to board a train to Montreal. O'Brien was arrested at Dulles Airport with a ticket to Mexico City. The Chicago Five were falling one by one, but the two who had warned the others were still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American continent. May 27th, 1951, Lake Superior, Minnesota. The manhunt was about to become legendary. FB Agent Morrison stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter as it cut through the frigid waters of Lake Superior. Intelligence reports suggested that Sullivan and O'Brien were trying to reach a Soviet submarine somewhere in the Great Lakes. The idea seemed impossible. How could the Soviets operate a submarine in American inland waters? But Morrison had learned not to underestimate Soviet audacity. Then they spotted something that changed everything. Through his binoculars, Morrison saw smoke on the horizon. As they drew closer, he could make out a small fishing boat, apparently disabled and drifting. Two men stood on the deck, waving distress flag. "That's them," Morrison said grimly. "Sullivan and O'Brien." But as the Coast Guard vessel approached, one of the men on the fishing boat raised what looked like a flare gun. Instead of a flare, it fired a green smoke signal that arced high into the sky. What happened next defied all expectations. From beneath the dark waters of Lake Superior, a Soviet submarine surfaced like a metal leviathan. Water cascaded from its conning tower as it emerged just 200 yards from the American vessels. Morrison grabbed the radio. "This is FBI Special Agent Morrison. We have a Soviet submarine in American waters. Repeat, we have a hostile submarine in the Great Lakes." The submarine's deck gun swiveled toward the Coast Guard cutter. For a moment, Morrison thought he was about to witness the first naval battle in the American heartland since the War of 1812. But the Soviets had a different plan. A rubber boat launched from the submarine and raced toward the disabled fishing vessel. Within minutes, Sullivan and O'Brien were aboard the Soviet craft, disappearing beneath the dark waters that had claimed so many ships over the centuries. The submarine vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Morrison staring at empty water and wondering how he would explain this to Washington. June 1951, J. Edgar Hoover Building, Washington, D.C. The investigation was about to take its darkest turn. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover paced behind his massive desk as Agent Morrison delivered his report. 3 members of the Chicago Five were in custody: Blackwood, Hartwell, and a mid-level State Department official named Charles Whitney, who had apparently been recruited later. But Sullivan and O'Brien had escaped to Moscow, and their escape had been too well coordinated to be coincidental. Someone inside was still helping them. "There's a 6th man," Hoover declared, his voice cold with fury. "Someone warned them to run. Someone with access to our investigation." Morrison felt sick as he realized the implications. The FBI had been penetrated at the highest level. Every move they made was being reported to Moscow. The paranoia was about to consume everything. Hoover's eyes narrowed as he studied the case file. "I want every agent who worked on this case polygraphed. I want their finances audited, their associations investigated, their loyalty questioned." Over the following months, the FBI turned on itself. Veteran agents found themselves under suspicion. Careers were destroyed by whispered accusations. The hunt for the 6th man became an obsession that would haunt American intelligence for decades. But the real truth was even more shocking. The 6th man wasn't a Soviet agent at all. He was Assistant FBI Director William Harvey, a paranoid alcoholic who had been feeding information to the Soviets not out of ideology, but out of a twisted desire to prove that he was the smartest person in the room. Harvey had been playing both sides, providing just enough intelligence to Moscow to keep his value while feeding the FBI enough genuine information to maintain his reputation as a top counterintelligence officer. His game was about to end. July 1951, Federal Detention Center, Washington, D.C. What you're about to witness changed everything. Thomas Blackwood sat in the stark interrogation room, his federal judge's robes long since replaced by an orange jumpsuit. Across from him sat Agent Morrison and a team of FBI interrogators, their faces grim with the weight of what they had discovered. For 6 hours, they had been pressing Blackwood for information about Soviet operations in America. The judge had said nothing, staring straight ahead with the composure that had made him famous in legal circles. Then Morrison played his final card. "Your wife doesn't know, does she?" Morrison said quietly. "About your weekend trips to legal conferences in New York. About the real reason you supported certain judicial nominees, about what you did to get your appointment to the federal bench." For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked. His hands began to shake. The confession that followed shocked everyone. "It started with gambling debts," Blackwood whispered. "In law school, the Russians found out, offered to help. At first, it was just small favors, introducing them to other students, sharing gossip about professors." Morrison leaned forward. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. By the time I realized what I had become, it was too late. They had photographs, recordings, evidence of crimes that would have destroyed not just me, but my family, my father's reputation, everything. But his biggest revelation was yet to come. Blackwood looked up at Morrison with tears in his eyes. "There are others, not just the 5 from Yale. We were just the beginning. The Russians have been recruiting from every elite university in America. Harvard, Princeton, Columbia. There are dozens of us, maybe hundreds." Morrison felt the room spin. The Chicago Five weren't an isolated cell of Soviet agents. They were part of a vast network that had been infiltrating American institutions for decades. America's greatest fear was becoming reality. August 1951, Sandia National Laboratory, New Mexico. The scope of the betrayal was about to be revealed. Dr. Rebecca Chen stood in the vault containing America's most sensitive nuclear weapons designs, watching FBI agents catalog the documents that David Hartwell had photographed over the years. As the laboratory's security director, she felt personally responsible for the catastrophic breach. How much did he get? Agent Morrison asked, examining a blueprint for a hydrogen bomb trigger mechanism. Chen's voice was barely audible. Everything. Bomb designs, production schedules, target lists, defensive capability. The Soviets now know exactly what we can do and how we plan to do it. The implications were terrifying. Morrison studied a photograph that Hartwell had taken of a document marked "Eyes Only, President." It detailed American plans for nuclear retaliation in the event of a Soviet attack on Western Europe. "Stalin knows our entire nuclear strategy," Chen continued. "He knows which cities we would target, how many bombs we have, where they're stored. The balance of power has shifted completely." But the worst revelation was still coming. Chen led Morrison deeper into the vault to a section containing the most classified documents of all. "This is what he was after in his final weeks before exposure," she said, pointing to a filing cabinet marked Project Sundial. Morrison had never heard of Project Sundial, but as Chen explained it, his blood ran cold. It was a theoretical design for a planet killer, a hydrogen bomb so powerful it could potentially end all life on Earth. The ultimate doomsday weapon was compromised. "The preliminary calculations are all here," Chen said, her hands shaking as she handled the documents. "If the Soviets build one of these..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Morrison understood this like we're looking at the potential end of human civilization, handed to America's greatest enemy by one of its most trusted defenders. This was beyond espionage. It was potential genocide. October 1951, Federal Courthouse, Washington, D.C. America was about to confront its greatest betrayal. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers as the trial of the Chicago Five began. Security was unprecedented. Federal marshals with submachine guns stood at every entrance, and the courtroom itself was surrounded by bulletproof glass. Judge Harrison Phillips gavelled the court to order as the defendants were led in. Thomas Blackwood, David Hartwell, and Charles Whitney in handcuffs, their faces drawn and pale after months in federal detention. The prosecution's opening statement silenced the nation. U.S. Attorney Sarah Davidson rose to address the jury, her voice steady despite the weight of history. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear testimony about the greatest act of treason in American history. These defendants didn't just steal secrets. They handed our enemies the power to destroy our civilization." She gestured toward a table covered with classified documents. "The evidence will show that the defendants provided the Soviet Union with atomic bomb blueprints, military invasion plans, and the identities of American intelligence agents, many of whom were subsequently captured and executed. The defense fought back with everything they had." Defense attorney Martin Gold stood to present his opening argument. "My clients are patriots who became disillusioned with American foreign policy. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were preventing nuclear war by ensuring that both superpowers had equal capabilities." The courtroom erupted in angry shouts from the gallery. Judge Phillips slammed his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the room. But the most damning testimony was yet to come. Elena Kozlova took the witness stand, her voice calm but her words devastating. For 3 days, she detailed how the Chicago Five had been recruited, trained, and operated. She described secret meetings in Washington parks, dead drops in Virginia suburbs, and radio transmissions that had sent American secrets to Moscow. The jury listened in stunned silence as she revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The verdict would reshape American intelligence forever. November 1951, Federal Courthouse, Washington, D.C. Justice was about to be served, but at what cost? Judge Phillips looked out over the packed courtroom as he prepared to announce the sentences. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts of espionage, treason, and conspiracy. Thomas Blackwood stood first. Despite his federal judge's training, his hands shook as he faced his own judgment. "Thomas Blackwood," Judge Phillips intoned, "you have betrayed not only your country, but the very Constitution you swore to uphold. I sentence you to death by electric chair." The courtroom gasped. It was the first death sentence for espionage in American history. The harshest justice in American history was being dispensed. David Hartwell was next. The man who had stolen atomic secrets seemed to have aged a decade during the trial. "Your actions have potentially doomed millions of innocent people to nuclear annihilation," Judge Phillips said. "Death by electric chair." Charles Whitney, the lowest-ranking member of the group, broke down in tears as he received a sentence of life imprisonment. His cooperation with investigators had saved him from the electric chair, but his life, as he knew it, was over. But the most shocking moment was still to come. Judge Phillips called for order as protests erupted both inside and outside the courthouse. Supporters of the death penalty cheered, while opponents screamed about the brutality of American justice. "Let this be a warning to anyone who would betray the United States," Phillips declared. "In times of peace, we show mercy. In times of war, and make no mistake, the Cold War is a real war, we show no quarter to traitors." The executions would haunt America for decades. On a cold February morning in 1952, Thomas Blackwood and David Hartwell were executed at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Their deaths marked the end of the Chicago Five, but also the beginning of a paranoid era in American intelligence that would see suspects behind every desk and traitors in every shadow. The hunt for spies would consume the next decade of American life, destroying careers, families, and faith in government itself. But 2 of the Chicago Five were still free, living new lives in Moscow. 1963, Moscow, Soviet Union. 12 years later, the final truth emerged. Robert Sullivan stood at the window of his Moscow apartment watching snow fall on Red Square. At 50, the former State Department official had become a shadow of his former self, haunted by the lives his betrayal had cost and the country he could never see again. His wife had divorced him. His children refused to speak to him. The other American defectors in Moscow treated him as a pariah, knowing that his escape had triggered the paranoid witch hunts that destroyed so many innocent lives. The price of betrayal had become clear. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. It was Michael O'Brien, the former CIA analyst who had fled with him. O'Brien looked even worse, thin, gray, with the hollow eyes of a man who drank too much and slept too little. "The KGB wants to debrief us again," O'Brien said wearily, "about American nuclear strategy." Sullivan almost laughed. After 12 years, the Soviets still didn't trust them. They were kept under constant surveillance, their contacts monitored, their movements restricted. They had traded American freedom for Soviet captivity, the ultimate irony of their situation. "Do you ever wonder," O'Brien asked, "if we made the right choice?" Sullivan turned away from the window. Outside, Soviet citizens hurried through the snow, their faces gray with the weariness of life under communism. The workers' paradise they had believed in looked more like a prison. "We destroyed our own country's security to help this." Sullivan gestured at the bleak cityscape. "Look around, Michael. This isn't the future we thought we were building." But their biggest shock was yet to come. That evening, a KGB officer brought them devastating news from America. The paranoid investigations triggered by their escape had led to the creation of something called the House Un-American Activities Committee. Thousands of innocent Americans had been blacklisted, fired, and ruined based on nothing more than suspicion. Your betrayal accomplished something we never could have achieved through espionage alone, the KGB officer said with a cold smile. You turned Americans against each other. You made them destroy their own democracy from within. The final betrayal was complete. Sullivan realized that their defection hadn't just stolen American secrets, it had poisoned American society itself. The paranoia they had unleashed would haunt America for generations, turning neighbor against neighbor and creating a climate of fear that was perhaps the Soviet Union's greatest victory in the Cold War. As he stared out at the frozen streets of Moscow, Robert Sullivan understood that he had become something worse than a traitor. He had become the architect of his own country's internal destruction, and in the end, both superpowers had lost their soul.